I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine you wake up and the sky above you is the wrong color. Not dark blue, not even stormy gray. Just wrong. Like someone took a sunset, turned it sideways, and stretched it permanently across the atmosphere. Orange-green, a little violet near the horizon where the twin moons had already started rising even though it was still technically daytime. And the sounds, God, the sounds. Not birds, nothing as simple as birds. It was more like, you know that feeling when you're underwater and you can hear sound from above the surface. Muffled but close. Layered. Like the air itself is humming a conversation you're not invited to. That was my first morning on Velhari IV. My ship was gone, my crew was gone. My emergency beacon was a melted chunk of composite metal in the mud 30 feet from where I'd landed. And surrounding me, at a distance of maybe 40 yards in every direction, standing absolutely still in the tree line, watching me with those wide, luminous eyes, were the women of the Ara Rin. The tribe. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because people always ask me this when I tell this story. No, I wasn't scared of them. Not at first. I was scared of the planet. I was scared of dying of infection or thirst or something with 12 legs that I couldn't name. I was scared of the fact that my emergency ping was fried and nobody knew where I was. The tribe just watched me. And somehow, that watching felt more like curiosity than threat. That was the beginning of 3 years that would change everything I thought I understood about contact, about belonging, about what it means when an entire civilization of people decides you are theirs. Not in a bad way, but completely, absolutely, irrevocably theirs. Let me tell you how it happened. My name is Darren Calloway. I was 29 years old when the Meridian Cross went down over Velhari IV. I'd been with the United Earth Diplomatic and Survey Division for 4 years by that point. Not a rookie, not a veteran. One of those mid-range guys who knew enough to not get killed by the obvious stuff, but still young enough to make the kind of mistake that gets you marooned on an uncharted world. The mission was routine. I hate that word now. Routine. People always say that before something stops being routine. We were doing a second-tier atmospheric survey of Velhari's southern continent. The planet had been flagged on the preliminary charts as Class 3 habitable, breathable air, acceptable gravity, no immediately dangerous solar radiation, but it was also flagged as minimally mapped. Translation: we knew almost nothing about what was actually living there. The plan was a 3-week survey pass, collect atmospheric data, document any obvious megafauna from a safe altitude, and log the preliminary grid coordinates for a proper ground team to follow up on in 2 or 3 years. Simple. Clean. I'd done 30 missions that looked exactly like that one. Then the solar interference hit. It came out of nowhere, which, technically, is exactly how solar interference always comes, but usually the ship's predictive array gives you a 40-second warning. We got about 6 seconds. 6 seconds to see the reading spike on every panel simultaneously, hear the navigator shout something I couldn't catch over the sudden screaming of the hull stress alerts, and then feel the ship lurch like something had grabbed it by the tail and yanked. We lost main propulsion first, then secondary. Then the navigation array went dark, and after that it was just math, the bad kind of math, the kind where you're in a gravity well and you're going down no matter what you do. And the only question is whether down takes you into a mountain or something slightly softer. We hit something slightly softer. The canopy of the Kethvara Basin's forest absorbed most of the impact. I know that because I was later told by the tribe's elder in her language, which I only partially understood by that point, that the forest remembered the sound of my arrival for weeks, like the trees kept whispering about it. I don't know if that's metaphor in Rinvith or if she meant it literally. With the Kethvara, the line between those two things is blurry. I was in the crew compartment when we hit. I'd strapped in when the alerts started, which is the only reason I was alive to tell you this. The Meridian Cross came apart in 3 pieces when it hit the canopy. I learned this later from examining the debris field, and my section pancaked into the root mound of what I can only describe as the biggest tree I have ever seen in my life. Something between a redwood and a cathedral, roots like walls, bark like armor plating. It caught me. I was unconscious for, I think, about 6 hours. I don't know exactly because my wrist unit was cracked and running about 40 minutes slow by the time I woke up. My head was bleeding from a gash above my left ear that looked worse than it was. 3 cracked ribs. A deep bruise across my left thigh from the harness lock that would turn spectacular colors over the next week. And that was it. 4 years of combat-adjacent field work and a planetary crash, and I walked away with a headache and 3 cracked ribs. The Corps later told me I should have been dead. I told them I knew that. We didn't need to discuss it further. When I came back to consciousness, the first thing I registered was the smell. Not smoke, though there was smoke, distant, probably from whatever part of the ship had landed somewhere in the trees and caught fire. No, the main smell was the forest. And I know that sounds generic, like I'm saying it smelled like trees, but this was different. It was complex in a way that I genuinely can't translate into words that would mean anything to someone who hasn't been there. Wet earth and something herbal, not mint, not eucalyptus, something that didn't have a name in any language I knew. And underneath that, something faintly sweet like cut grass on a warm afternoon but layered with something metallic. Clean metal, not rust or blood, just mineral, like the planet itself had its own scent signature. I lay in the debris for a minute doing inventory. Hands, working, feet, working, ribs, not working great but acceptable, head, pounding but I could think clearly enough to know I needed to move. My field pack had stayed attached to my back through the whole thing. That was luck, pure dumb luck. Inside it, emergency rations for 4 days if I stretched them, a water reclamation pouch that could filter almost anything biological, my field knife, a multi-tool, a flare kit, 2 flares. The emergency beacon was separate and I didn't know yet that it was fried, a Mylar emergency thermal sheet, 2 basic med patches, a hand torch, and a small hardback journal that I'd brought for personal use. I always kept a journal on long missions. Old habit from my first survey instructor, who used to say that you can reconstruct almost any situation from good notes, but memory alone will lie to you. That journal ended up being one of the most important things I had with me. I spent the first hour after waking doing what you're supposed to do in a crash survival situation, establishing perimeter, locating water, assessing immediate threats. Standard protocol. I moved carefully because of the ribs and because the forest floor wasn't stable, exactly. It was soft in some places and hard in others, and the root systems of the giant trees were so complex that you could step in a gap between 2 roots and drop 3 feet without warning. I found the emergency beacon melted into the dirt about 30 feet from my impact point. Whatever the fire had hit on its way down, some fuel or power line or battery pack, had cooked it beyond recovery. I stood there looking at it for a moment and felt the first real wave of something like fear, not panic. Just that cold, clear understanding that sits in your stomach like a stone. Nobody was coming for me unless I found a way to make myself findable. I had the 2 flares, but those were point-of-use emergency signals, not sustained beacons. Good for one-time visibility. Not useful until I had reason to believe something was flying overhead that might see them. I moved back to the crash site and tried to see if anything from the ship's communication array was salvageable. It wasn't. The main hull section was roughly 40 yards east of where I'd landed, and it had hit hard, harder than my section, and there was nothing in the wreckage that still had any power. By the time I finished the survey, the light was changing. That weird layered sky, the wrong color one I mentioned, was shifting towards something darker, the violet deepening, the orange pulling back. The twin moons were rising in earnest now, and the sounds of the forest were changing too, taking on a different register. Deeper, more complex. Whatever the daytime things were settling down to, the nighttime things were waking up. I set up my position at the base of the giant root tree, backed into a natural alcove between two roots where nothing could approach from behind, wrapped myself in the thermal sheet because the temperature was dropping faster than I'd expected, and ate one of my ration bars while I thought about what to do next. That's when I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement exactly, just presence. The awareness that the space around you has changed its quality. Like when you're in a room and someone walks in behind you, and you can feel the air displacement before you hear the footstep. I turned very slowly, keeping my hands visible and open, not reaching for the knife, just turning. There were 5 of them at the edge of the root system. Standing at varying heights, the roots gave the forest floor a kind of terraced quality, all of them completely, absolutely still. And they were watching me. The Ara Rin, the wild tribe, the uncontacted tribe, the tribe that no survey mission had ever documented because nobody had ever gotten close enough, stood in the half-light of the twin moons rising, and they looked at me with those wide, luminous eyes. Here's the thing about first contact that they don't prepare you for in training. All the protocols are about what to do when you make contact with a civilization that has technology. Protocols for communication, for cultural exchange, for diplomatic framing. What they don't spend as much time on because it's rarer is what to do when you make contact with people who have none of that, who have never seen you, who have no framework for what you are. Because in that moment, you're not the advanced civilization. You're the alien. I sat very still. I kept my hands open. I breathed slowly. And the 5 women of the Ara Rin stood at the edge of the roots and watched me breathe. None of us moved for a very long time. Eventually, one of them, she was standing slightly in front of the others, which I would later understand meant she was the youngest scout, the one designated to take the risk of proximity, tilted her head about 30 degrees to the right. Just that. One small movement. Studying me the way a person studies something that almost fits a category they know but not quite. I tilted my head 30 degrees to the right. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, her mouth didn't move, but her eyes changed. Something behind them, like a door opening slightly. She looked back at the others. A sound came from her, very low, very musical, nothing like human speech. 3 syllables that rose on the last beat. The others came forward. That was my first night on Vilhari IV. They didn't take me anywhere that first night. They just stayed. The 5 of them arranged themselves around my root alcove at comfortable distances, and they sat down, and they watched me, and eventually, after I'd eaten my ration bar and drunk some filtered water and done the best I could to communicate, I'm not a threat through body language alone, they seemed to decide I was acceptable enough to stop actively monitoring, and some of them dozed off. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone would have, but I felt safer than I had since waking up in the crash debris, and that was something. In the morning, 2 of them left and came back with food. I want to be very precise about this moment, because it was the first real communication we had. When they brought the food wrapped in large flat leaves, steam still rising from whatever was inside, they didn't hand it to me. They placed it on a root about 3 feet from where I was sitting and then stepped back. Not far back, just back, giving me space. That's manners. That's considered behavior. In any culture in the galaxy, the instinct to give someone space to make their own choice about food is a form of respect. I recognized it. I picked up the packet, unwrapped the leaves. Inside was something that looked approximately like a root vegetable that had been cooked in liquid, broth maybe, with several other things I couldn't identify by sight. Here's the dilemma. Field protocol says you use the biological scanner to test anything you might consume on an uncharted world. My scanner was in the part of the ship that had burned, so no scanner. What I had instead was the fact that these 5 people had apparently eaten something like this themselves. I could smell the same thing on them, faintly, and they were very much alive and functional. I ate it. It tasted strange. Not bad, just nothing like anything I had a reference for. Earthy and sharp at the same time with a texture that was softer than I expected. It sat fine. No immediate adverse reaction. I would spend the first 2 weeks in a constant low-grade evaluation of everything I consumed, checking myself for symptoms, keeping notes in my journal. Some things made me feel slightly off. Most things were fine. One thing, a small purple berry that grew in clusters near the waterline of the basin streams, turned out to cause about 4 hours of vivid hallucination, which I found out the hard way. After that, I always waited to see them eat something first. The hallucination incident, by the way, was apparently hilarious. I know this because I came back to myself 4 hours later lying on my back staring at the sky, and the women around me were making a sound that I was already beginning to recognize as laughter. It's different from human laughter in pitch but not in feeling. Something in the chest, light and genuine. They thought I was ridiculous. I probably was. Those first 2 weeks were, look, I don't want to make this sound like it was easy, because it wasn't. I was in pain from the ribs. I was sleeping in a roof alcove with a mylar sheet when it rained. I was eating food I couldn't identify and worrying every morning that today was the day something in my biology would react badly to the local chemistry, and I'd be in serious trouble with no medical supplies to speak of. I was desperately lonely in a specific way, not isolated. I was never isolated. There were always Rin women nearby, but linguistically alone. Cut off. I could watch everything and understand nothing of what was being said. That's a particular kind of loneliness that I think only people who have been through real language isolation understand. You can be surrounded by people and be completely, unreachably alone because there's no bridge between what's in your head and what's in theirs. So I started building the bridge the only way I knew how. I pointed at things and made sounds. This sounds absurd, I know. It was absurd. I would pick up a rock and hold it out and make a questioning sound, rising intonation, which seems to be nearly universal as, "What is this called?" And wait. The first time I did this, the scout who'd been the first to approach me, the young one, I eventually learned her name was Theva, stared at the rock, stared at me, stared at the rock again, and then made a sound. "Kethwari." I said Kethwari. She blinked, made the sound again. I made the sound again. Something happened in her face. The door-opening thing again, but wider. She turned to the nearest other woman, an older one who was sitting nearby doing something with woven fibers, and made a whole rapid string of sounds. The older woman looked at me, made a sound that was lower, slower, looked at Theva again, made another sound. Theva looked back at me. Pointed at herself, Theva. Pointed at me, rose intonation. "Darren," I said. "My name is Darren." "Darren." Close enough. She repeated it 3 more times. Darren, 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 like she was memorizing the sound shape. Then she pointed at the older woman, Sarai. Pointed at another woman sitting nearby, Vethka. Pointed at a fourth, who was watching us from a distance with her arms crossed. Myra. Pointed at the fifth, who was up in a tree. They climbed everything, always watching us from above. Rinsal. 5 names, the first 5. I wrote them all in my journal that night. Their names, phonetically spelled, with little notes about what I observed of each of them. It was the beginning of what would eventually become 47 filled pages of linguistic notes, another 30 pages of cultural observation, and something approaching a partial dictionary of Rinvith, the Kethvara language. It took me about 3 months to reach functional basic communication. By functional basic, I mean, I could understand and express simple needs, actions, and observations. By 6 months, I was holding real conversations, those slow ones, with a lot of gaps and a lot of hand gestures filling in for words I didn't have yet. By the end of the first year I was, by any reasonable measure fluent, though with an accent that apparently was a constant source of gentle amusement. The language itself was extraordinary. I want to say that because I think it gets lost sometimes in the narrative of this experience. People hear alien tribe and they think primitive. They think simple. They're wrong. Rinvith has grammatical structures that have no equivalent in any human language I'm aware of. There's a tense, I call it the relational past, because there's no English word for it, that describes an action in the past specifically in terms of how it changed the relationship between the people involved. Not just what happened, but what it meant for the connection between the people. Every past action has both a temporal marker and a relational marker. You can't just say, "We did this." You have to say, "We did this and here is what it cost or gave us in terms of our bond." That grammatical fact alone tells you something profound about how the Kithvara think about the world. Relationship is not secondary to action. It's built into the action at the grammar level. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first months were about basics, food, shelter, safety. Learning not to do things that were considered offensive in ways I couldn't anticipate. Speaking of which, I offended everyone within the first week at least once. The first offense was by accident and I didn't understand what I'd done until much later. In Kithvara culture, walking directly towards someone is aggressive. It implies you want to challenge or confront them. You always approach at a slight angle. It communicates respect and peaceful intent. I walked straight towards Sarai, the older woman, one morning to try to ask her about something, and she went completely rigid and her eyes went flat, and every woman nearby stopped what they were doing and looked at me. I froze. I had no idea what I'd done. Theva appeared from somewhere at my elbow and made a quick gesture with her hand. I watched it. She was showing me, step to the side, move to an angle. I stepped to the right, angled my approach. Sarai's posture released, slightly. I still got a long look that communicated very clearly that I was on notice. After that, Theva started shadowing me. Not following me, shadowing me. She'd stay close enough to intervene if I was about to make another error, but far enough that it didn't look like she was babysitting me. It was subtle. It was kind. It was the act of someone who had decided that my continued well-being in this community was something she was going to quietly take responsibility for. I noticed I was grateful. I didn't know how to say thank you, yet in Rinvith, but I made a point of looking at her and inclining my head whenever she saved me from a mistake, which apparently was a gesture they understood similarly, because she would respond with that same slight head tilt she'd done on the first night. The second offense was about my journal. About 10 days in, I was sitting near the main fire. They always had a central fire going in the evening, the whole gathering point of the camp, writing my notes. Vethka came over and watched me do it. I didn't mind. People watched me do everything. It was expected and reasonable. I was strange. Of course they watched. But then she reached out and touched the edge of the journal page. And I, on pure reflex, pulled the journal slightly away. Protective instinct, personal item. Wrong move. Vethka's face went still in a very specific way. She pulled her hand back, and without another sound she stood up and walked away. I asked Theva about it later. By then I had enough words to ask simple questions, with a lot of charades filling the gaps. What I gathered from her response was something like this. Among the Kithvara, refusing to share something you're actively engaged with in front of others is a very serious statement. It says, "This thing is mine and you are excluded." Not private in the way humans understand it, more like active exclusion from something happening right now. By pulling the journal away from Vethka's curiosity, I had essentially told her she wasn't worthy of participating in my activity. I felt terrible. I spent the next 2 days trying to figure out how to make it right with my extremely limited vocabulary. Eventually, what I did was sit near Vethka at the fire and open the journal and hold it out toward her. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she took it, turned the pages slowly, looked at my writing, my sketches, my phonetic notations. I watched her face. It was thoughtful, careful. She turned every page. When she handed it back, she made a sound, one word that Theva later helped me understand meant something like thorough or careful in the making. A compliment about my record keeping, from a culture that didn't write things down but that valued precision of memory enormously. After that, Vethka occasionally brought me things she thought I should record. Things she thought were important enough to preserve. I always did. The third offense took about a month to unravel, and I don't want to get into all the details, but the short version is, I accidentally implied, through a combination of actions and unknowing symbolic behavior, that I considered the basin to be my territory rather than shared space. This was a big one. It took a genuine, effortful reparative process that Sarai, who was the elder, I'd figured out by then, had to oversee. I don't fully understand what I did or what the repair ceremony involved, but at the end of it, several women placed objects at my feet and looked at me very seriously, and Theva whispered something very low and emphatic near my ear that I was later able to translate as approximately, "Don't do that again." I didn't. After the third offense and its repair, something shifted. The women of the Kethvara camp, there were about 40 of them in the main group, with others in satellite positions across the basin that I would slowly come to understand over time, began treating me differently. Not better necessarily, but differently. More integrated. Before I was watched, after I was included. There's a difference, a real felt difference. Being watched means you're still other. Being included means the group has provisionally decided you are part of something. I built a better shelter, with help. Theva and 2 others showed me how to use the materials available in the basin, a combination of wood, dried fiber, and a clay-like substance from the stream banks that hardened when it dried, to make something significantly more weatherproof than my root alcove. It took 3 days and my ribs screamed at me the entire time, but when it was done I had a small, low, solid structure that could keep the rain out and keep body heat in. The night I moved into it, Rinsal, the one who was always in the trees, dropped something small through the ventilation gap I'd left in the roof. I found it the next morning on the sleeping mat I'd made from dried plant fiber. A small carved object, smooth, shaped somewhat like a stylized bird but with details that didn't belong to any earth bird. A Velhari creature, something local. A housewarming gift. I kept it on my journal cover for the rest of the time I was there. Let me tell you about the Kethvara Basin. I know I keep using it as a backdrop, as a setting detail, but it deserves more than that. It was one of the most remarkable places I have ever been, and I say that as someone who has done 4 years of survey work across 17 worlds. I've seen ice plains that stretched for 3,000 kilometers. I've seen gas formations that moved like slow lightning across mountain ranges. I've seen bioluminescent oceans. The Kethvara Basin was something else. It sat in a geographic bowl, hence the name, which came from the Rin word for held or cupped, maybe 80 kilometers across at its widest point, ringed by a series of elevated ridgelines that were too low to be mountains but high enough to create a distinct microclimate inside. The forest within the basin was significantly denser and more diverse than anything on the ridges above it. The soil was richer. The water was better. The air had that mineral quality I mentioned, but inside the basin it was more concentrated, and over time I came to understand that it wasn't just atmospheric. There was a geological process happening beneath the basin floor that pushed specific mineral compounds up through the water table and into the air. Something the Kethvara understood intuitively, and which I could only observe with the limited scientific tools I had, my eyes, my senses, my journal. The forest had layers, 5 distinct canopy levels. The highest, where the giant root trees lived, the ones whose canopy I'd crashed through, was above the perpetual mist layer that formed every morning and burned off by midday. The lowest was the root floor, which was half underground, where the root systems of the upper trees merged and interlocked into something that functioned more like a continuous organism than a collection of individual plants. The Kethvara called the root floor the listening, which is as precise a description as I've ever heard of what it felt like to move through it. It felt like being inside something that was paying attention. Wildlife was abundant. Most of it was harmless to humans in that it had no interest in humans whatsoever. I appeared to be outside the category of things most Velhari fauna were programmed by evolution to interact with. There were exceptions. The large ambush predators of the mid-canopy, which I eventually called vaulters in my notes, for obvious reasons, would test anything unfamiliar with a probing rush, pulling back before making actual contact. This happened to me twice in the first month. Both times, the Kethvara women who were nearby responded not by fighting, but by making a very specific concerted sound, all of them at once, a chord rather than a melody that appeared to confuse or disorient the vaulters enough to disengage. The Kethvara did not fight the basin's predators. They coexisted with them in a relationship I can only describe as mutual negotiation. They understood which spaces were shared and which were exclusive. They moved through the basin in ways that communicated to the fauna, not just to each other, their presence and their intentions. It was something so practiced and integrated that it didn't look like knowledge anymore. It looked like instinct. But it was knowledge, incredibly deep, generationally preserved, precisely transmitted knowledge. Which brings me to the Kethvara themselves. I need to be careful here, because I'm aware that my perspective is limited, and I'm also aware that people will ask me about their appearance, and I want to be accurate without being reductive, because reductive is where you lose the truth. The Ara Rin are, and I'm going to use this word knowing it's not precise enough, beautiful, not in a standardized way, not in the way that gets put on recruitment posters, but in the way that a river is beautiful, or a thunderstorm, or anything that has been entirely shaped by the demands of its environment. They were adapted to the basin in every physical detail. Their coloring, which ranged, across the 40 women I knew well, through patterns of deep bronze, pale silver green, and rich near black, provided natural camouflage in different layers of the forest. Their eyes, which I've mentioned, were large and luminous, and could function effectively in very low light. Their hearing was exceptional. I regularly saw them register sounds I couldn't detect at all, turning slightly in the direction of something happening half a kilometer away. Their physical capability was striking to observe, not because of anything supernatural, just the result of a life lived in full physical relationship with an environment that required everything. They climbed with an ease that made it look effortless. They moved through the root floor in near darkness without stumbling. They could remain absolutely motionless for extended periods when circumstances required it. When they ran, which they did sometimes, usually in the early morning before the mist burned off, something that seemed recreational as much as practical, they were fast. Not humanly fast. Faster. I want to be clear. I am not describing this to catalog them. I'm describing it because it's relevant to something I understood more deeply the longer I was there, which is this. The Kethvara were not a simple people in a simple place. They were a sophisticated people in profound relationship with an extraordinarily complex place. The things about them that might look like primitivism to an outside observer, no written language, no built technology, no formal hierarchy in the organizational sense, were not absences. They were choices, or more accurately, they were the result of a continuous philosophical tradition that I was only beginning to understand by the time I left. Sorai was the elder, not because she was born into it and not because she'd fought for it, because the collective had recognized over time that her understanding was the deepest. That was how it worked. There was no formal title and no ceremony, but when Sorai spoke, everyone listened in a particular way, not out of fear, out of recognition. Like when a doctor speaks in their area of expertise, and you lean in slightly, even if you're skeptical, because you can feel that they know something you don't. She began speaking to me directly about 4 months in, when my Rinvith was adequate to follow her slowly and with assistance. The conversations we had in those early months were mostly practical, she asking me about where I came from, what my world was like, why I was there. I answered honestly. I told her about Earth, about the core, about the survey mission. I told her about the crash and about the beacon that didn't work and about my hope that eventually a rescue mission would locate me. She listened to all of this with her characteristic focused silence. Then she asked me, "Do you have anyone waiting for you?" I thought about my family, my colleagues, the work. "Yes," I said, "many people." "Do they know where you are?" "No," I said, "not yet." She was quiet for a moment, then, "While they don't know you are here, do you understand that?" I said I thought I did. "No," she said, gently but with precision. "To understand it, you have to stop looking at this as waiting. You are here. This is a place. Something is possible here. If you look at it as waiting, you will miss what is possible." I wrote that down in my journal that night, word for word, to the best of my translation ability. It's the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me about surviving something. Not just about surviving Velhari IV, about surviving anything. Stop looking at it as waiting. You're somewhere. Something is possible. I tried. And eventually, not right away, not quickly, I started to succeed. There's a line between the first and second year that I can identify fairly precisely. It was the night of the Kethvara marking ceremony that I did not know I was participating in until I was already in the middle of it. Let me tell you how that happened. It was toward the end of my first year. My Rinvith was solid by then, real conversations, real nuance, real misunderstandings that got resolved through real discussion rather than charades. I had a functional daily life in the basin. I contributed to food gathering, to material gathering, to some of the craft work. My human hands, it turned out, were useful for certain fine detail work that required a different grip angle than the Kethvara hand naturally provided. I had relationships with specific women in the group that had their own characters. Theva was still something like my unofficial guide and closest ally, patient with my continuing mistakes in ways that I never stopped being grateful for. Vethka had become a kind of intellectual companion. She was the one most interested in the systematic side of my knowledge, the way I organized information, the way I cataloged things. Rinsal was the one who taught me to climb, badly on my part, adequately by the end, and who seemed to find my efforts endlessly entertaining. Myra, who had watched me with her arms crossed on that first night, had remained the most cautious about me the longest, and winning her respect, not warmth, respect. Their different had required consistent demonstration over months that I was not going to cause harm. Sorai I'll come back to. The ceremony, what I later came to understand was the ceremony of Velkithrin, which translates roughly to the naming of what stays, happened without preamble. One evening the whole group gathered at the central fire, which was larger than usual, and there was food I hadn't seen before, prepared specifically, ceremonially, with more care than the daily cooking. And there was sound, which is what the Kethvara call what I would call music, though it doesn't translate well to that word. It was layered sound produced by voice and by specific hollow-core objects that function like instruments, creating harmonics that I felt more than heard. I was sitting at the edge of the gathering, not sure whether I was participant or observer, which was a position I'd been in many times in my first year, and which I'd learned to handle by watching carefully and waiting for cues. Sorai came and sat beside me. She said, "Tonight is for naming." "Naming what?" I asked. "What has stayed," she said. "Things that came into the basin and became part of it, things that belong here." I wasn't putting it together yet. I was thinking she meant, I don't know, features of the landscape maybe, named sites. I'd encountered naming ceremonies for specific places and resources in my research. "You," she said, because I clearly wasn't understanding. Tonight is for naming you. I didn't know what to say to that. I tried to say something intelligent and probably failed. You have been in the basin for close to a year, Sorai said. You have not left, you have not harmed, you have learned, you have contributed, the basin knows you now. She paused. Do you want to be named? I want to emphasize. I knew this was significant. I didn't know how significant. I didn't fully understand what the naming meant structurally in Kethvara terms until much later. But I knew that Sarai asking me directly, with that particular gravity in her voice, meant this was a choice, and the choice was real. I said yes. The ceremony took most of the night. I won't describe every detail of it because some elements feel like they belong to the community rather than to me to broadcast. I've thought about this a lot, what's mine to share and what isn't, and I try to err on the side of discretion for things that are sacred to them in ways I may not fully understand. What I'll say is this. There was a long period of sound that I participated in, not singing. I couldn't sing in Rinvith, but a kind of resonant breath sound that required participation. There was a shared meal. There was a point at which Sarai spoke a string of syllables over me, not to me over me like she was speaking them to the forest itself, the basin itself, and I understood enough of the words to know she was describing not who I was but what I demonstrated. The specific qualities she named, translated roughly, careful, present, willing, strange in a way that does not cause wrongness. Strange in a way that does not cause wrongness is not exactly a ringing endorsement in human terms, but in Kethvara terms it's high praise, I've since come to understand. And then they gave me a name. Not Darren. They'd been using that my name adapted to Rinvith phonetics since the beginning. This was different. This was a Rinvith name. The name the basin had given me, interpreted by Sarai. Kethsavar, which means, as close as I can get it in English, the one who fell from the sky and decided to listen. I've never had a name that fit me better. From that night, things changed. I was no longer the outsider being accommodated. I was a member of something, with the rights and responsibilities that came with it. The relationships I'd been building solidified into something with structure. Theva became formally my guide, not a temporary assignment but a recognized role. Vethka began sharing with me materials from the tribe's preserved knowledge, oral histories, practical knowledge systems, things that were transmitted specifically to members. And other women in the group, ones I'd had less direct contact with, began engaging with me differently, seeking me out, talking with me, including me in activities and decisions and discussions. It was during this second year that I began to understand what the Ara Rin were actually doing in the basin, the full picture of it. They weren't hiding, they weren't simply living, they were maintaining. The basin, the extraordinary, complex, beautiful, dangerous basin, did not sustain itself through pure nature. It was tended, not in the way humans tend farms or gardens, more organically than that, but deliberately. The Kethvara moved through the basin in patterns that were not random. They redirected water flow in small ways that preserved specific plant communities. They managed the population dynamics of the root trees through selective interventions I would not have recognized as interventions without knowing to look. They maintained specific relationships with specific fauna populations, not domestication, not control, but something more like stewardship. The basin was not wild in the way that word implies untouched. The basin was profoundly, carefully, generationally tended. It just looked wild to an eye that didn't know what it was looking at. That was me when I arrived. I thought I'd crashed into wilderness. I'd crashed into a garden. Understanding this changed how I saw everything. It also, I think, changed how the Kethvara saw me specifically, seeing that I could understand it, that a creature from another world could learn to see what they were doing and appreciate its depth. Something shifted in the collective regard toward me when that understanding became visible. I can't point to a single moment. It was gradual. But I could feel it. Looking back, I can see the tests clearly. In the moment, I wasn't processing them as tests because they didn't present themselves as tests. They were just situations, just the life of the basin, which was full of situations. But they were tests. I'm going to tell you about 3 of them, the ones that I think mattered most. The first test, the Walter Den. About a year and a half in, during what I would roughly call the basin's dry season. There wasn't a true dry season, but there was a period of about 6 weeks when rain became less frequent, and the air pressure changed, and everything in the basin shifted into a different register of activity. A vaulter established a den in a section of the root floor that the Kethvara used as a transit path between 2 parts of the basin. This was a problem. Vaulters are territorial. Once a den is established, the territory around it becomes effectively impassable, because the vaulter will pro-brush anything that enters it. And while the Kethvara had their concerted sound method for disengaging a pro-brush, sustained use of that method over multiple passages a day would stress the whole population dynamic in ways that mattered. The solution, as Sorai explained to the group one evening, and I was in the group now, which meant I was part of the discussion, was to re-establish the path through a different route that avoided the vaulter's territory. But that route went through a section of the root floor that had unstable ground, a collapse risk in several places. It could be made passable, but it required significant work, clearing some root obstructions, bridging a collapse point with materials, several days of work. Nobody asked me to contribute, but everyone knew the work needed doing, and I was there. I worked for 3 days on that project. My hands blistered. The root floor at that section was dark and close, and I was working mostly by feel because my hand torch was long dead, and the Kethvara used woven fiber light sources that produced a softer glow. The work required me to lie on my stomach in spaces that pressed my ribs still tender, a year and a half later into the root structures. It was miserable. At no point did anyone praise me for doing it. At no point did anyone comment on my participation. I was simply part of the work, and the work got done. At the end of the 3rd day, when the path was passable, Myra, the one who'd been the most cautious about me, the most reserved, fell into step beside me as we walked out of the root floor. She matched my pace exactly, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said in Rinvath, "You didn't stop." "No," I said. "You were uncomfortable." "Very. But you didn't stop." "The path needed to be passable," I said. She was quiet for another moment, then she said, "Yes," and that was it. But from that point, Myra spoke to me differently. Not warmly, she wasn't built for warm, I don't think, or at least not in an outward direction, but with a specific directness that she hadn't given me before, like I'd been elevated from one category to another in her internal classification. The second test, the younger child. About 8 months before I was found, so, roughly 2.5 years in, a woman arrived in the main camp who I hadn't met before. Kethvara individuals moved between satellite positions and the main camp, and I'd met most of the network by this point, but this one had been in the outermost position, the farthest from the main camp, and she was young, younger than any of the others I knew well. Her name was Velen. She arrived in the main camp in a state that I recognized, even across cultural distance, as something like crisis. Not panic, not fear, a kind of sustained tension that had become so normal for her it was almost invisible, except to anyone who was looking, which, by that point, I generally was. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't ask. The Kethvara don't respond well to direct inquiry into personal distress. There's a protocol around it, a form of spatial and temporal respect, where you make yourself available without demanding information. I had learned this the hard way in my first year. What I did was sit near where Velen was during the evenings, not close, not demanding interaction, just present. And I kept working on whatever I was doing, usually my journal or my craft work, or the translation project I'd been building with Vethka, in a way that was visible and calm, steady. On the fourth night after her arrival, Velen moved closer to where I was sitting. She didn't speak. She watched me write for a while. Then she asked, "What is that?" I explained what writing was. The concept took a while, but she was quick. I showed her some of the phonetic notation I'd developed for Rinvith. She said, "Does that keep it from going away?" I said yes, that was exactly what it did. She was quiet then. "Teach me." We spent the next 3 weeks, an hour or two each evening, working through the phonetic system. I designed a simplified version for Rinvith specifically. By the end of 3 weeks, she could write her own name and about 30 words. She would practice on smooth, flat pieces of bark, using charcoal from the fire. I did not ask her what she needed to preserve. That was not my question to ask. But I watched something in her change over those 3 weeks. The sustained tension eased. Not because the situation that caused it necessarily changed. I genuinely don't know what that was, but because she had a tool, agency, something she could do. When Sorai observed this, Sorai observed everything. She found me one afternoon and said, "You understood what was needed." "I hope so," I said. "You didn't ask what was wrong." "It wasn't my place to ask." Sorai looked at me for a long moment with that expression I'd come to know well, the one that meant she was calibrating, measuring, filing. "It's a good thing," she said, "to know what is yours to do and what isn't." The third test, the outsider. This one is more complicated. About 2 years and 8 months in, a small group of travelers came through the upper ridgeline. I caught this through Kethvara intelligence gathering. They always knew what was on the ridges, through a network of sound signals and positioned watchers that I was now part of before we had any visual confirmation. The travelers were not Kethvara. They were from one of the settled communities on Velhari IV's northern coast, human contact communities, places where some limited interaction with off-world presence had occurred over generations. They were Velhari, but culturally very different from the Rin, and they were moving through territory that the Kethvara considered their stewardship zone. This had apparently happened before. There was history. I didn't know all of it, but I could feel the shape of it in how the group responded when the news came down the signal network. Not hostility, not panic, but a very focused, coordinated alertness. Sorai called a gathering that night, discussed it. I participated in the discussion. I had a standing place in those discussions by this point. Most of the conversation was about positioning, about whether to make contact or simply make the travelers aware they were observed and let them find their own way through. Then one of the women, Rinsal, up in her tree, speaking down to us as she usually did, said something that I caught only part of. I asked Theva quietly to fill in what I'd missed. Theva said, "She's asking if Kethsavar should meet them first, if seeing a being from beyond the world would change the dynamic." I processed that. "You want to use me as a what?" "A surprise." Theva thought about how to explain it. "If the travelers see you first, they will have many questions. The questions will slow them down. By the time they finish being surprised about you, they will have agreed, without knowing they agreed, to stay in the positions where we can watch them." I stared at her. "You want me to be a distraction?" "We want you to be useful," she said, "which you are usually." I looked at Sorai. Sorai looked back with an expression of complete neutrality that told me nothing, because Sorai's face was a highly controlled instrument. I went to meet the travelers. I won't drag this out. Yes, they were profoundly startled by a human who spoke imperfect but functional Rinvith emerging from the tree line. Yes, they had many questions. Yes, the Kethvara used that window to establish their watching positions. And yes, the conversation I had with the travelers eventually shifted into something more substantive. Information about the northern settlements, about what was happening on the coasts, about the broader world of Velhari that I had seen almost none of in nearly 3 years in the basin. Including that there was a United Earth Survey ship that had been making passes over the southern continent for the last 2 months. My heart did something complicated when I heard that. I'd been trying, on Sorai's advice, to not be waiting, to be here, to be present, and I had largely succeeded at that. But hearing that a ship was looking, that Earth was still looking, did something I hadn't expected to myself. Something that was hope and grief and relief and terror all at once, because hope after you've stopped hoping is not a simple feeling. It's violent in its way. It breaks something open. I thanked the travelers, helped them understand the basin boundary through the conversation without ever explicitly defining it, watched them choose on their own to move back toward the ridgeline when they were done. Then I went back to camp and sat by the fire for a long time, not eating, not writing, just sitting. Theva came and sat beside me. She said nothing, neither did I. Eventually she said, "You heard something. They said a ship from my people has been flying over the southern continent." "For how long?" "2 months. Theva was quiet. "They are looking for you." "Maybe," I said. "Or looking for the crash, or just surveying." "But they might find you." "Maybe." Another silence. Then, "How do you feel?" It's a deceptively simple question. In Rinvith it has additional layers. The relational past, grammatical structure means the question also carries the implicit freight of, and what does this feeling cost us in terms of what we have built? I understood the full weight of the question. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. She nodded, put one hand briefly on my arm, a touch that among the Kethvara carries a specific meaning. I am here and this is real and you are not alone in it. Then she took her hand away, and we sat there together by the fire until the moons rose. I need to preface this section by telling you something about how the Kethvara relationship structure works, because without that context, what happened next won't make the kind of sense it needs to make. The Ara Rin do not, in any traditional sense, have a hierarchy of claimed relationships the way most cultures, human or otherwise, tend to. There is no concept of exclusive partnership that maps onto anything I was familiar with. What they do have is a concept of communal claim, which I will try to explain as accurately as I can. When the Kethvara community collectively determines that something, a resource, a creature, a being belongs to the basin, they claim it. Not ownership in the extractive sense. More like acknowledgement of fundamental belonging. The basin has claimed this. We, who are the basin's people, therefore have a relationship with this thing. It is ours to protect. It is ours to hold. It is ours in the deepest sense, which is the sense of responsibility and relationship, not possession. This is the Velkithrin, the naming of what stays, taken to its full expression. When I received my name at the ceremony a year and a half earlier, I was named as belonging to the basin. That was the first claiming. The naming ceremony says, this entity has chosen to stay and the basin has acknowledged it. What I was not told, because I didn't have the full context to understand it, and Sarai would later explain that she had told me only what I was ready to hear, was that Velkithrin is a two-stage process. The first stage is the basin's claim, the forest's acceptance. The second stage, which typically happens after the individual has been fully tested and known, is the community's claim, the people's acceptance. And the people's claim is enacted not through ceremony, but through each individual making their statement directly, in their own words, at their own time. It had apparently been happening for months, gradually, quietly. Each of the women of the Ara Rin, in their own timing, had been offering, in the specific ritual phrase that I hadn't recognized as such, their claim. Theva was first. I know this because Sarai told me afterward. The night I'd sat at the fire after learning about the ship, when Theva put her hand on my arm and said, "I am here and this is real and you are not alone in it," that phrase in Rinvith is also the claiming phrase. It is used specifically in that context. I hadn't known. I'd understood the comfort. I hadn't understood the formal weight. Myra claimed me the morning after the route path work, when she said you didn't stop, and I said the path needed to be passable. She'd said, yes. In Rinvith, that yes in that context following a test statement with that specific tone is a claim, a designation. You have proven the thing that makes you ours. Rinsal had claimed me during the teaching writing period with Velen. I don't even know the exact moment. She'd come down from her tree, which she rarely did at midday, and sat with us for a session, and at the end she'd said something that I'd translated as, he sees the shape of what's needed. That was her claiming statement. Vethka had claimed me through the journal, when she'd taken it and looked at every page and handed it back and said, thorough. That word, in the context of reviewing someone's careful work, is a claim of intellectual kinship. The basin has given you a mind that fits here. You are ours. And so on. 40 women, not all at once, over months, over tests and meals and fires and hard work and early mornings in the root floor and evenings watching the wrong color sky shift toward violet. 40 claims. I didn't know until Sarai told me. On the morning of the day, my rescue ship appeared on the horizon. I heard the ship before I saw it. The sound of a survey vessel's engines is distinctive. I'd heard it hundreds of times. I knew it in my cells. And when it filtered down through the canopy layers of the basin, distant and growing louder, I was in the middle of helping with the morning meal preparation. I stopped. Everyone around me stopped. They'd heard it before I did, obviously, but they'd been watching me, knowing the sound was coming, waiting to see my face when I heard it. Theva was standing directly across from me. Her face was doing the controlled thing that Kethvara faces do when something is emotionally significant and they're choosing to manage it. The door partly open, partly closed. Your people, she said. I think so, I said. My voice came out wrong, rough. I looked around, at the fire, at the half-prepared morning meal, at the structure I'd built with help, small and solid against the root tree, at my journal sitting on the packed earth shelf I'd made for it, at 40 faces looking at me with varying degrees of the same controlled, present, honest emotion. Sarai appeared. She moved through the group and stood in front of me and she said, come with me. We walked a short distance from the camp, far enough for privacy. She stood and looked at me and then, for what might have been the first time in all our conversations, she looked uncertain, not about herself, about how to say what she needed to say. I will tell you something now, she said, that I should have told you before. I told you what you were ready for. I think you are ready for the rest. And she explained Velkithrin, all of it, both stages, and told me about the months of claims, all 40 of them. I stood in the forest and listened to this while overhead, muffled by canopy, a United Earth Survey ship circled and its sensor array swept the terrain. When Sarai finished, she waited. I didn't say anything for a long time. I was doing that thing where too many feelings arrive simultaneously and you can't process any of them individually because they're all happening at once. I was thinking about Theva's hand on my arm, about Myra saying, you didn't stop, about Rinsal dropping the carved bird through my roof, about 3 years of being watched and included and tested and named and known. I said, Sarai, what does it mean? When the community claims someone, what does it actually mean in practical terms? She said, it means you are ours to protect, you are ours to hold. Whatever comes for you comes through us first. Whatever you need not ask alone. The basin is your basin, we are your people. I said, even after I leave. And Sarai looked at me with that expression, the calibrating one, the measuring one, and she said, Kethsavar, do you think you are leaving? I didn't know how to answer that. Leaving your people is not the same as leaving yours, she said. Both are true. You have 2 people now. That is unusual. But the basin has made unusual things before. The ship's engines were louder now, coming around for another pass. They were running sensor sweeps. I knew the pattern. I'd run enough of them myself. They were going to get a hit on my biological signature eventually. A human in a basin of Velhari fauna would flag immediately. I should signal them, I said. Yes, Sorai agreed. I looked at her. When I come back. When you come back, she agreed, and that was all, and it was enough. I reached into my pack, which I always carried, 3-year habit, and found my last flare. I'd been saving it without consciously deciding to save it, waiting without waiting. I walked to the highest accessible point in the basin, a root system elevation that gave a narrow window through the canopy to the sky, and I fired the flare. 40 women stood below me and watched it arc into the air. The ship circled back within 12 minutes. The rescue team that came down in the shuttle was 4 people. I knew none of them. They were from a different division, a search and recovery unit, which told me the Meridian Cross had been officially declared lost at some point in the last 3 years, and I'd been moved from missing crew to presumed dead. Standard practice after 18 months unlocated. The team leader was a woman named Captain Sorrel. She had the kind of face that had seen a lot of recoveries and had learned to read them quickly without projecting. She looked at me for about 3 seconds when I emerged from the tree line to meet them at the shuttle landing site. They'd found a clearing on the basin rim. I'd guided them in with arm movements visible through the canopy gap. And then she said, "Specialist Calloway." "Yes," I said. "You're walking," she observed. "I am." "You look," she paused, recalibrating. "You look surprisingly functional." "I had help," I said. She looked past me at the tree line. I turned. 40 women were visible, some in the canopy, some at ground level, some on the root system elevations. Not hiding, not threatening, present, watching. Captain Sorrel's expression was a controlled professional assessment that I could read through the control because I'd gotten very good at reading controlled expressions. She was surprised, and beneath the surprise, carefully respectful. "Uncontacted population," she said quietly. "Not anymore," I said. She looked at me again. "You made first contact." "They made first contact," I corrected. "I was the one who landed in their basin. They came to me." A pause, then, noted for the record. I had 40 minutes at the shuttle before medical assessment required me to get on board. Sorrel was efficient and kind about it. She gave me the 40 minutes without asking for them, just built them into her timeline. I think she understood something, even without knowing the details. Recovery coordinators get good at reading the shape of things. I spent those 40 minutes in the basin. I want to be honest about those minutes because I want to be honest about all of it. It was not a clean or easy 40 minutes. It was not a cinematic farewell where everything felt resolved and complete and beautiful, though it was also all of those things. It was messy with feeling in a way I can't fully articulate. 3 years is a long time. 3 years is a different shape of time than any other duration I've experienced, because every day of it was so immediate, so present, so full of attention. I am a member of the Ara Rin. I have been named by the basin and claimed by 40 people. I was leaving, and I was also, as Sorai said, not leaving. I sat with each of them. Not for long, 40 people, 40 minutes, the math is brutal, but briefly with each. Theva gripped both my hands in both of hers and looked at me very directly and said, "Come back often. Not come back someday. Often. An expectation, not a hope." Rinsal, from somewhere above me in the tree branches, dropped one more carved object through the canopy. I caught it. It was a bird again, her recurring symbol I'd noticed, but this one was in flight, wings fully extended. "For going," she called down. "Thank you," I called back. Myra shook my hand. She had learned the gesture from watching me with other people, and she executed it with precise formality, and then looked at me with that direct, unvarnished regard that I'd worked so hard to earn. "Don't forget what staying requires," she said. It sounds like a parting piece of wisdom, and it was, but in context, knowing the Kethvara, knowing the language. It was also a very Myra thing to say, which is to say it was clear-eyed and a little demanding and completely genuine. I told her I wouldn't forget. Vethka gave me my journal. I hadn't realized I'd left it in the camp in the commotion of the morning. She'd gone back for it. She'd wrapped it in the large flat leaves that the Kethvara used to preserve things from moisture and tied it with woven fiber. She put it in my hands and said, "Keep making records. The record makes things real." I held the journal and thought about everything in it. 3 years of notes, 3 years of learning, 47 pages of Rinvith linguistic documentation, cultural observations, ecological observations, personal entries that started formal and got messier and more honest as time went on, a partial dictionary, the phonetic teaching system I'd built for Velen. I looked at Vethka and said, "This is the most important thing I'm carrying out of here." "We know," she said. "And Sorai." I walked back to where Sorai was standing alone, slightly apart from the others as she often was, not isolated but positioned, and we stood facing each other. No charades, no translation gaps. 3 years of language between us, solid and real. "When I come back," I said, "I want to bring others, people who can learn the way I learned. People who can listen the way you taught me to listen." "We will think about that," she said, which in Rinvith means, "the community will consider it and the community's consideration will take the time it needs, and you don't get to rush it." It was not a yes. It was not a no. "I have a question," I said. "I should have asked it months ago, but I think I needed to be leaving to ask it." "Ask." "The claiming," I said. 40 people claimed me. What am I supposed to do with that, in practical terms? What do I owe?" Sorai looked at me, the calibrating expression, the measuring one, and then something I'd only seen a handful of times in 3 years, amusement. Real, felt, warm amusement, not quite a smile but close to one. "What you've always done," she said. "Stay present where you are, don't stop listening, come back, bring people who can listen." "That's it." "Kethsavar," she said, "what did you think the claiming was? Debt?" I didn't know what it was. "It was recognition," she said. "You don't owe recognition, you receive it. What you do after you receive it is your own, but we thought you should know." I nodded, looked at the basin one more time, the root trees, the canopy layers, the morning mist just beginning to burn off, that particular mineral herbal sweet scent, and I let it into me. I don't have a better way to say that. I just let it in, let it settle somewhere permanent. Then I walked to the shuttle.